I'd like to introduce Mr. Bill Moore from Special Operations Command Pacific, or SOCPAC. You've heard that acronym a few times already. Sorry again for the acronym soup that our military friends are prone to, myself included. We'll do our best to make sure we spell out the acronyms. So Bill is the lead strategist and campaign planner for Special Operations Command Pacific. Prior to serving in this role, he had over 30 years of active duty service in special operations, with operational experience in Central Asia, Africa, and East Asia. He works closely with interagency and joint force partners to shape and develop counterterrorism and great power competition campaigns. Additionally, Bill works with U.S. Special Operations Command, that's SOCOM, to shape the future of special operations based on anticipated requirements. He is also a distinguished graduate of the Joint Advanced Warfighter School, or JAWS. So without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I will turn the floor over to Bill. We're going to pull his slides up here as he comes on up. And Bill, welcome to the workshop, and thanks for being here today. It's over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you, Lumpy, and thank everybody for being here, especially thanks to APCSS and the previous speakers for hosting this. It's been a very interesting week. So I just want to clarify what Lumpy said up front. These are my personal opinions. They don't necessarily reflect SOCPAC. I'm not sure SOCPAC has a standing position. We welcome debate within our command. We think, it helps us find the truth ultimately. The theme overall, and I think you'll catch it as we go through this, is context and integration. And what I mean by that is, I don't recall who said it, but he said, if you understand one country, you understand no country, right? And I think you can take Burma right now as an example. Obviously having some internal problems. You see Russia and China influencing that in the UN and perhaps within the country. Thailand has a role in this, Bangladesh. Everything's bigger than a national country, and the context also applies to elements of national power. Military is one element. As was discussed during the previous brief and throughout the previous days, it really needs to be integrated with other elements: financial, law enforcement, intelligence, information, etc., to be effective. Because I think, as we all understand now, our principal competitor, rival, China, does a relatively good job of integrating these elements of national power and whole of society. So I'm going to talk about the challenges and opportunities in the gray zone. Unfortunately, I'm not going to touch on everything Joel was hoping I was going to touch on, but he had some great, maybe that'll come up in questions and answers. So I'm going to talk where we are today and where we anticipate the future of the challenge to be in the near term. And I just want to, and I don't mean this as a attack on anybody, but Sun Tzu, Karl, von Clausewitz, they didn't write strategy. They wrote books on thoughts on strategy, thoughts on war. It's on us to figure out, hey, where are we at today? What is the truth? Where do we want to go? And then how do we arrange activities and integrate elements of national power, allies, and partners to achieve those ends? And, we can argue that we have viable strategic ends. We got means, but the ways are not well integrated. It's just part of being in the U.S. system, right? We designed a weak government on purpose to maintain freedom of the people, right? So we didn't want the government overcoming that, but we need to relook that. We don't want to become an oppressive government, but we got to do better at integration. Again, we have different problems, different goals than the ancient strategists, but I still recommend reading those texts to gain insight. But I would also, and I know this is going to sound a little bit flippant, but I don't mean it to be. Bruce Lee, I think most recall, as a famous martial artist, but he is also a great philosopher if you read his book. And one of the things he talked about was, and I'm paraphrasing, you need to free yourself of the classical mess. And what he meant by that is a lot of martial arts were very big into prearranged forms, and you would react a certain way if somebody did something, but that didn't work out in the real world. And I think to some extent with our doctrine and our terminology, we are stuck in a classical mess right now that we need to break out of to account for the challenges we face in the 21st century. Now, there's a lot of discussion the first day, Dave Maxwell, OSD SOLEC on terminology. And terminology is important. You can't have a profession if you don't have a lexicon and you have a common understanding of those professional terms. But that's not my focus today. What I want to focus on is the threat we're facing today, and then some of the challenges and maybe some of the opportunities to get after it. So I'm going to argue unapologetically that the Chinese Communist Party is an existential threat to our way of life, our security, and our prosperity. And I think that's true for any free nation out there. And I think generally, and this is a classical mess, we are trying to defend an international system that is unraveling, according to Kissinger. And and in some respects, certain aspects of it are gone. So what we're trying to defend is in our rearview mirror. So when you look at the interim national security strategy that came out, I believe last Friday, it may have been on Monday, by President Biden's administration, it says we need to chart a new course. And I think that's our opportunity. What do we want the new international system to look like? And how do we ensure that free nations are leading it versus authoritarian nations like China? China's principal strategic approach is to displace and replace the current international system. So that's the gist of the problem. So with that, let's go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to dwell mostly on the major trends, but I will walk around the box. So when I look at Indo-PACOM and I think about SOF, and I'm saying I, but it's really the whole team. We got a lot of really smart officers, civilians, and contractors in SOCPAC. We see all the threats identified in the NDS. We see Iran, although not much. It's not something we focus on. However, if there was ever an armed conflict with Iran, if deterrence failed and things escalate, they have demonstrated the capability to conduct activities in our region out here. In the 80s, they conducted attempted bombings in Bangkok against the Saudis. In 2012, they conducted another attack in Bangkok, another attack in New Delhi, targeting Israelis. So it indicates that the Iranian threat network is active in our AR. Obviously, China, we're going to talk more about that, so I'm not going to belabor it now. That's our number one challenge. North Korea, I think you've been reading the news. They continue to evolve their weapons of mass destruction. Continue to be unpredictable, a disruptor in the international order. And it's a hard problem to deal with. I mean, if North Korea was an island in the middle of the ocean, it'd be pretty easy to deal with. But when it borders China and borders Russia, it's a different issue altogether. Joel already talked about this. Russia is reemerging in our AOR. I worked out here in the 80s. It was a significant threat then. And I think, it's definitely not the threat it was in the 1980s as the Soviet Union, but they are rebuilding their military power. And they are attempting, much like China, to pull our partners away from us, to weaken our alliances out here. So that's something we watch, but we don't put a lot of effort against. Then you got violent extremists. So that was our focus, obviously. I think it's well known, and that's why many conventional military officers and civilians confuse SOF as a counterterrorism force. But if you go back in history after World War II, when I consider modern SOF forming, we were formed really for what we're calling great power competition today for the Cold War, to fill in those spaces. Now, I'm not saying what we're doing today parallels the Cold War. Obviously, there's some parallels, but it is different, and we'll talk about that. After 9/11, the psychological shock to our nation, obviously we responded. You could argue strategically we made some missteps that we're still paying for, but it's a tragedy anytime innocent civilians are killed by violent extremists. So. And as Joel pointed out, we have over 60% of the Muslims in our AOR. As a previous senior officer in SOCPAC pointed out, they are mostly at peace. That's the strategic opportunity. We want to keep it that way. We don't want large-scale instability because that would distract us from our primary effort of deterring and competing with China. So what we're doing right now is just trying to maintain pressure on the extremists so they can't expand. But I don't think it'll be naive of us to think that threat has been defeated. We have seen some changes in the threat here. First female suicide bombers in the Philippines, more foreign fighters. The attack in Sri Lanka caught us off guard, the Easter bombing. I think that was the second major attack after 9/11 when you looked at the fatalities. So we do have a lot of activity, but the good news is most of our partner nations in the area have adequate intelligence and police forces or military to get after that. So other things we look at, if you look at the smaller black boxes, we're very SOF has the lead for WMD for the military for dealing with that problem set. And what we're looking at is how can we limit proliferation? Cyber is not necessarily a SOF problem to solve, but it's a problem that we can be on the receiving end of. And obviously, we're seeing the impacts of cyber increasingly on the security network. And then natural disasters, or Indo-Pacific is probably the most prone of all the theaters. All the theaters have them, but if you remember the Christmas tsunami, I believe that killed upward to 250,000. We'll never know the exact numbers. And then the illicit networks out here, and that's what I'm talking about here, is principally organized crime and how they tie in with both state actors and non-state actors to facilitate some of their activities. So it's a lot to deal with. And, we take our operational guidance from Indo-Pacific on what to focus on. So we principally focus on competing with China and maintaining pressure on BEOs. So I want to shift to that box to the left middle, major trends. And Bob Jones may talk a little bit about this. He's kind of been a thought leader on it, but it's been the power shifts or transitions of power, and that's really what we're dealing with. That's what creates this instability, right? It's the rise of China. It's arguably we're approaching a multilateral international order right now. We're not a unipolar power like we were shortly after the Cold War. And we're not sure how that's all going to settle, if it's going to settle. And then you have the rise of non-state actors empowered by social media, other advanced technology. I mean, you have ISIS now employing drones relatively effectively. You had a small country like Azerbaijan that employed drones very effectively against Armenia in their recent war. So we can't assume that we're going to dominate all these domains, and that we got to figure out how we're going to deal with that, how we're going to compete with it. New strategies, what I call non-conventional war. Bob Jones, the next speaker, he's going to disagree, but the gray zone is principally what I'm talking about. So you heard in the PACOM, the argument from Andy was, hey, we have to focus on conventional war. We can't afford to lose it. Well, then that opens up a whole window of opportunity for our adversaries to maneuver in this non-conventional or gray zone space to achieve their objectives, short of traditional war. I would argue we're at war now, and I'll talk more about that. I realize that's problematic with many people, and I understand why they disagree with it, but I think I'll capture 2 more slides, but we got to mobilize at the appropriate level to address this threat. Finally, rapid technology evolution and proliferation. So we're already seeing military technology proliferate around the world, and we're doing it, others are doing it, and then more and more people have the ability, even non-state actors, like I mentioned ISIS, to develop their own technology out there, right? It's our dominance is coming into question, especially with peer actors, and I do call China a peer, at least in our region, and Russia. And the fourth industrial revolution, without going too much depth, but I think this is going to transform the world in fundamental ways that we just can't comprehend right now. With the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and I'm not just talking about the military, it's going to transform the economy. And first time in history that the evolution in technology has resulted in less jobs. And that's going to impact all our countries. That's going to be a shared problem around the world on how we deal with that. And we can anticipate instability due to that. But the other point on this, and probably more relevant to this discussion for gray zone, is whoever dominates the fourth industrial revolution is probably going to dominate the world, right? And China is very aggressively pursuing to dominate these industries. They call Made in They had a concept a while back. They said they did away with it, but in reality, they haven't, called Made in China 2025, where basically they dominate the production of all of this. And this ties into a discussion earlier this week on the rare earth elements and how critical they are. So while we're very focused on the Middle East right now, and the reason we formed CENTCOM in the first place under Jimmy Carter when he was president was to secure our access to oil, because that was absolutely critical. What do we have to secure in the near future as the fourth industrial revolution comes around? And I think that's something we need to think about as we move forward with allies and partners. We don't want China having the dominating that. Don't mind sharing, right? But we definitely don't want them dominating it. Economic entanglement, unlike arguably you could say the same was true of the Soviet Union with the Warsaw Pact and the different insurgent elements they were supporting around the world, like El Salvador. They were economically dependent on the Soviet Union. When they collapsed, a lot of those insurgencies disappeared. It wasn't so much that we defeated them, as we like to claim, they just lost their support. But today, a number of our allies and partners, their number one trade partner is China. That's asking a lot for them to make tough decisions with that relationship, to put their economy at risk, because economic prosperity is also tied to their security, their internal stability, their ability to sustain a military force. So it's a wicked problem that we're going to have to work through. Network threats, I should have took that off, but basically talking about BEOs and how they're connected across national borders and also geographical commands that we deal with. And let's go to the next slide. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, this is something I developed a while back. It definitely needs to be updated, but I was trying to show the asymmetry of our approach to what China calls war and their different documents on how they're trying to achieve these objectives. So what it is, the big takeaway is they have mobilized their whole of government and the whole of society to support this, to achieve their ends. So I would argue, and the question is it war by other means? Because they are using coercion to compel. It may not be military force, but that's always in the background right there supporting this. Are we at war? And if we're not at war, what is it? And I don't think there's a space between peace and war. And I think Bob Jones and I agree on that. It's just war by other means. And I think we're calling it a gray zone war right now. So China sees armed conflict as a episodic event as a way to signal. When they invaded India, when they invaded Vietnam, it was never intended to take over. It's just say, hey, this is a strong interest. We're going to use military force, and then we stop. I mean, their border conflict with India, after they pulled back and negotiated from a position of strength, they gave India back the military equipment that they basically procured during that conflict. And then they go back to steady state competition or war, whatever you want to call it, to achieve their ends. We tend to have a peace war paradigm, and while calling something war in the West, or still means something different that's very dangerous, and that's, I think, the next speaker's point. Other countries don't see it that way. They're at a continuous state of war. Our competitors see it that way, and they have mobilized to do it. So we got gray zone now, and we're starting to get after it. And I would argue that a lot of other nations have awakened to the threat that China poses, but also the difficulty of dealing with it due to the economic interdependence we spoke earlier of. And you can see the goals up here, right? So they want to radically revise the international order, regional hegemony, make the world safe for authoritarian government. I mean, you see that whether it's Venezuela or currently in Burma, where China and Russia are supporting all these governments, because those are really about the only countries that can get to align with them to support their effort. Whereas, yes, we use coercion also, but what we're trying to do is maintain norms that, as a previous speaker mentioned, has enabled the entire world to some extent to, the rise with the economic prosperity that our system enabled. So I guess the problem, okay, we don't call it war, we call it something else, but how do we urgently mobilize and sustain a sufficient response if we keep referring to this as peace? Because peace does not, I mean, peace is, you got a peace dividend, you downsize the military, you downsize your foreign engagement to some extent, and you focus internally. I think that's a challenge our nation is wrestling with. And, Carl kind of gets to it. You have to understand the kind of war that you're in before embarking. And I think we increasingly understand, but we don't have systems in place to get after it. Now, a couple of other things I want to address that I don't have on the slide, but I want to talk to it on this slide. So a couple of strategists have referred to China as a predatory state, and I think that's a useful term. What it means is they have a propensity to grab other people's land and resources. We see that with China. We see it with Russia and Crimea, but China is probably the biggest case. They also, you got an ideological struggle going on, authoritarian versus free and open international order. China believes their system's better, and they're trying to promote that. You got the economic competition, which we already talked about with the Made in China 25, but there's also other places they're trying to displace U.S. influence, right? They're increasingly getting international organizations with large numbers. They often call them interns, and they're trying to rewrite the documents in these international to reflect Xi thought. So you're almost seeing Mao's mass line at a global level, where there's a correct way of thinking. If you don't think that way, you're going to be punished. And we'll talk more about that, I believe, on the next slide. And then finally, there's a military competition. And I think where SOF is sometimes guilty is we kind of dismiss that and say, no, we're going to win this in the gray zone, although it's not true. I mean, I would not rest everything on it. China is developing a very capable military. I don't think they're there yet, but they're not developing in a military just to do parades, and they want that option. So, previous question and response, from the last iteration here was, hey, is our military dominance forcing them into the gray zone? And the answer is appropriately yes. If we start competing well into the gray zone, they still have their vital national security interests. Are they going to pursue it by the military? So we need to find a balance between being ready for traditional or conventional war and advancing our interests in the gray zone. Next slide, Lumpy, I'm sorry. I'm watching the clock here, make sure I don't go too long. So these are just some of the tools they use in the gray zone. I'd like you to take a look at our previous Secretary of State's comment right below. The People's Republic of China has free reign in our system, and we're completely shut out of theirs. That's an asymmetric advantage, right? I assume we have our asymmetric advantages too, but China spends, we estimate, I don't know if we'll ever know for sure, $8.9 billion a year on propaganda. And they're hijacking our tools of propaganda like Hollywood, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So let's just start off on the left. You see that China demanded the firing of the Houston Rockets executive when he had a tweet over Hong Kong, and he went to stand with them. Fortunately, they did not fire him, but he did resign after a year. I don't know if that was related or not. But the fact that they had the gall to ask, and then they actually came back and said, well, you misinterpreted. You misinterpreted what we said. What they said was pretty darn clear. Last month, Estonia intelligence comes out, open source. It warns of silence world dominated by Beijing. It's all the way in Europe. In the middle, China's operating out there and censoring what people can say or punishing them if they do. Today, I saw a news release in Germany, a children's book. China directed it not be published because it mentioned that the COVID virus started in China. So the publisher took it out. So that's the type of influence. We're just being silenced around the world. So I kind of like the way Estonia framed it. And really one of the biggest threats, when you look at the military threat, we look at everything else, but when you look at the irregular threat, I like to focus on what United Front Work Department, and I'll just call it the United Front. And it focuses mostly internally in China, but it also focuses on these large Chinese diaspora around the world and influencing their opinions and leveraging them to achieve their objectives globally. So I give a couple of examples. When the Olympic torch was going around both in Australia and in San Francisco. China mobilized a large number of the United Front in those countries because there was pro-Tibet protesters out there, and they went out to shout down the pro-Tibet protesters. When Xi came to visit the U.S., they mobilized. The United Front was able to mobilize a number of Chinese Americans and Chinese going to school, et cetera, to take a day off and, basically cheer Xi coming. So they have a lot of influence, and it's amazing. I believe the number, a Chinese expert can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they have 300 million people outside of China around the world. So it's a lot of leverage. We already talked about the fourth industrial revolution. The other part, the picture is really meant to show OBOR, Overseas Belt and Road Initiative, where they do these large infrastructure. And it wasn't that long ago, not even 2 years ago, where you would talk to State Department and they say, hey, this is great. This is good for the nation. It's because we didn't see they didn't understand the threat, and we just understood it a few months prior. But what they're really trying to do is establish leverage points where they can control that nation's decisions. Imagine if they came in our country and they own our electric power, if they own our telecoms, that's just two examples. They run ports, and there's different ways to phrase this. There's a city port or city park port, and then a base type example. And what we mean by that is they frequently go in, and we've seen this repeatedly in a number of occasions. They'll go in and they'll build a port or some other industrial facility. Then they'll build an industrial park, and then they'll build a city to house all the Chinese workers. And that gives them a lot of leverage. And later on, they'll try to get agreements to start bringing in the military slowly. And that's how they expand their influence around the world. And it's not an immediate threat. It's incremental. It's growing over time. So I like to refer to it as a gray rhino. I think everybody's familiar with black swans. It's like 9/11 attack was a black swan. A gray rhino is an attack that or a threat you see coming, like climate change, for example. But hey, it's a ways off. We can ignore it. And that's what we've done with China for years. And over time, they achieved facts on the ground that perhaps can only be undone by military force, which is not our desire. Face mask diplomacy, supply chains. I think you're familiar with that. But obviously, we're not opposed to China providing face masks and respirators to countries in need during a national health emergency. But the messaging that came with it is basically what they attempted to do is ignore any blame they had in this virus spreading around the world by not containing it. I got a picture of yuan there. That's the currency. And that's, this is where, again, I'm talking about how they use economic coercion, economic incentives, elite capture. They'll buy off corrupt politicians to buy influence. But maybe the bigger concern for me is I'm looking at the evolution of digital currency. We got a really smart, couple of smart guys in our command that look at this. And the world's probably going to go to digital currency. I think that's just a fact. And if they get the lead on establishing the norms for digital currency, the US dollar is going to get minimized, and our ability to influence international events is going to get minimized. So I think that's something we got to look at, and clearly not a military problem. Cyber, and then the other on the upper right, is the surveillance, pervasive surveillance technology. And I believe, from what I read, open source, China may be helping Burma right now surveil a lot of the Burmese protesters online and shut down their systems. So this is something that is a threat potentially that can be used globally. It's not just going to happen in China. They're exporting this to a number of countries in Africa and other places in the world. We talked about the territory grabs. So here we got in the South China Sea, you have one of the islands. I'm sorry, I don't recognize which island it is, but the point is they built these islands up over time. And we had a senior U.S. Intel representatives. They said if China did this over a period of 3 months, it would have been a clear act of war. But instead, they did it over a period of 5 years, little incremental steps. Then you got the little blue men, and this is a complex problem. So they look like fishing boats on the outside, but if you ever watched a James Bond movie and they have to make the special cars for James Bond, these are kind of that. They got hardened hardened hulls so they can ram other boats. They got sophisticated communication systems, and they actually work for the PLA Navy. And they go out and they harass areas. So, like for example, if they want to establish this island you're looking at above, the first thing they'll do is they'll put 100 of these fishing boats around it, which is really the Chinese maritime militia, and then they'll block it off for other countries. So let's say that's in Philippine international waters and they want to go out there and go fishing. They're denied. Legally, what are you going to do? Well, you might send out a Coast Guard vessel, and the Philippines Coast Guard is not very robust. You're going to go up against 100 boats. But even if they did, China has a cabbage strategy, right? So they'll have 100 vessels. They'll have the Coast Guard on the outside, and they'll have a Navy outside of that. But I realize that we're getting short on time, Lumpy, so I'll speed this up because I do want to get to the next slide. But the gray zone, incremental, ambiguous, integrates multiple elements of power. It nullifies military responses and high-risk tactics. So risk confusion, I want to talk about, we can do that during questions. Next slide, Lumpy, I'm sorry. I'll rush through the next one. So we can't fix everything, but incrementally, I think state and soft teaming, because if this, like Dave Maxwell said earlier, if this is political warfare, then State Department should be leading. And SOF has a long history of teaming with State Department, and we're actually doing that in the AOR. We did it principally for counterterrorism. We embedded operators within the embassy to coordinate with the different agencies, USA, law enforcement, et cetera. Assist, facilitate U.S. leadership in multinational responses. Competitive advantage. Terrorism is a trans-regional threat that we all care about. China wants to displace us as the leader of, for orchestrating multinational approaches to counterterrorism. So it is an area of competition. It's not just counterterrorism. Same thing with natural disaster response or illicit proliferation of WMD or drugs. So we have an advantage there. We need to maintain it, and we need to recognize it is part of competition. Number 3, global scouts. I probably can't go into that based on time constraints, but we have people in the embassy, but we also need our guys and gals out in the field with the population, getting a good sense of what's going on the ground. Assist and advise nations in enhancing their resistance and resiliency. And that's not just soft. We say resistance, I know you're thinking of guerrilla warfare, et cetera, and that could be, but it can be conventional military resistance. And then if that fails, then we have a resistance in the background, which means they can't resolve achieve their political goal rapidly, which they desire to do. So we hope that's a deterrence. And then resiliency, what I'm looking at there is multinational support. So China cannot coerce countries economically, right? This is not military, but it supports military. If we all work together and we have something like the Pacific, the trade partnership that we fell out of, understandably why it wasn't the best deal, but we need something like that where people have options, or other countries have options. Support State Department and others, dominate the narrative. SOF has some very impressive information operations capabilities, and they're only getting better, but they're very much constrained because outside of the war zone, it's very hard, as Dave Maxwell mentioned, for us to get approval to do anything. It can take a long time. And information operations have to be responsive to the problem at the time, not a year afterwards. Discrete options, I would just ask you to use your imagination on things SOF can do to counter malign activities below armed conflict. And we're not talking lethal or kinetic, but we're looking for ways to disrupt. And then finally, support the joint force. And this gets after the previous debrief. We have to balance, we have to make sure that hopefully we deter a conventional fight, but if we get in one, that we can win it. And what SOF used to do, it probably will continue, but I also think we're going to integrate some pretty impressive advanced technologies that will make us more effective and more helpful to the joint force. Very much apologize. I had to rush through those past 2 slides because I'm over time, but Lumpy, back to you.